Well, welcome to the beginning of history. We mark that because we now have a written record. There's a danger in this course that you're going to end up just with a dizzying array of images that you're trying to cram into your hard drive. So as we begin the history part of art history, let me introduce three themes that we're going to be looking at throughout this unit and really throughout the course. First, how does art convey notions of power and authority? Both religious and political, and in the case of the ancient Near East, these are closely intertwined. A second theme is how does art declare or reflect sacred space? And I'm using a very general term because, of course, we're going to be looking at a lot of religious traditions in this course. And finally, and I introduced this in my third lecture on Judith and Holofernes, what stylistic conventions emerge in the art of these civilizations? And again, we're going to continue building our art terminology and our analytical toolbox. So, beginning with the political context of Sumeria, one of the defining features of the Sumerian civilization, the first major civilization that we know in Mesopotamia, is that its citizens were loyal to their city-state and to its patron god. The king is viewed as blessed, or in some case not blessed by the gods, but the king himself is not viewed as a god. The founding myth of this civilization, and one that will be important throughout the ancient Near East, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. I have a link to this, by the way, on your Moodle site if you want to look at it. But the account begins by describing how Gilgamesh, who is a king who is in fact partly a god, angers the gods by abusing his power. He specifically demands that he have the right to sleep with young women the night before their wedding, what's called droit de seigneur in later medieval times. And it's particularly shocking because he demands not only that he get to sleep with peasant girls, but also with the nobility, which really tease off the leaders of the city. And the story goes on about how the gods discipline him and educate him to become essentially a better ruler and a man god who better serves the god. Now, it's interesting, what you're seeing here are what are called Sumerian votive figures. Hundreds of these were found in archaeological sites in Sumeria. It is no other time in the history of the ancient Near East has there been anything like this amount of non-royal sculpture, at least that survived in this kind of abundance. So these are not kings, these are patrons, these are ordinary people approaching the gods. Why do they use dolls? These are surrogates for the people. And so this is a particular use of sculpture for worship or sacred space. But another aspect of the Sumerian political context that I think, at least, these figures demonstrate is the change in uncertainty that is part of life in Sumeria. And I know Ms. Jacobs will have talked about this. So one element of uncertainty in Mesopotamia, and we will contrast this soon with the Nile, is that the Tigris and Euphrates were extremely unpredictable rivers. They were constantly changing boundaries. Their flooding was not predictable. They created a tremendous uncertainty in the lives of people who really relied on these rivers for their livelihood. The river valleys were also subject to constant threats of invasion. There aren't really any natural barriers that protect these civilizations, high mountain ranges, etc. And finally, because they were organized into city-states rather than a unified Sumerian empire, as you might expect, the city-states were always fighting with each other. So these are people, it's a powerful civilization. It is the most advanced civilization at the time, but it's a civilization living under constant threat and uncertainty. So does the art reflect that? I would argue, and we'll move on and look at these more closely, that in fact these votive figures do convey anxiety, uncertainty, a certain fearfulness toward the gods. You note that the Sumerians did not have a very reassuring religion. They believed that the dead person survived in the form of a ghost who lived in the underworld, and that surviving relatives needed to provide funerary offerings, food, drink, oil, sacred goods, and if if they didn't get these offerings from those who came behind them, and if they weren't buried properly with such goods, their ghost would be forced to wander around. And of course, this is a real incentive for the relatives to bury them properly, because who would you guess that those ghosts haunt? Well, the relatives who had failed to bury them properly. I would note, by the way, the Sumerian underworld wasn't real appealing either. The dead, for instance, lived in utter darkness, and again were completely dependent on these offerings. So this is not a society filled with hope or confidence. And looking at these figures more specifically, what do you see? What do you notice about these figures? I mean, it strikes me that at least what strikes me first are these wide open eyes. These are highly alert people. And in fact, the eyes are clearly larger than life. This is iconic or symbolic, an indication that the persons who placed these votive offerings, these votive sculptures in front of the entrance to the gods, were trying to signal that they were watchful, that they were aware that they needed to please the god, that they were concerned about the likelihood of entering the afterlife. You notice there's not much facial variation. Again, these are iconic figures. These are not individuals. There's no impression that the votive figure is made to look like the person who's appealing, except perhaps male or female. They're not proportional. The heads and shoulders seem to be larger, and that's actually reflective, at least so archaeologists think, of the fact that the Sumerian religion held that the head and the shoulders were where the soul resided. Note, too, that these as sculpture are very simple figures. I mean, this is almost the sculptural equivalent of stick figures. So essentially, you see cones and cylinders. You also, again, see very iconic postures. All of the votive figures are portrayed with their hands clasped, standing in a very upright, solemn position. Where would these votive figures be? They would be in the temples, or the ziggurats. And the most famous of these is probably the ziggurat that was discovered in Ur, and excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s. Now, this is actually a photograph, not a graphic image of what it might have looked like. And the reason is that this ziggurat was actually reconstructed by Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Now, what political statement might a reconstructed ziggurat make? I think probably Saddam Hussein was attempting to show that he was powerful, that he was in some way the heir of the great rulers of Sumeria, the leader of a great civilization. But notice that this building would have made a political as well as a religious statement just by towering over all other buildings in the city, indicating the central significance of the gods. Also, its central significance as a public building, because the ziggurats were apparently used as public storehouses of food, which was then handed out to the workers who engaged in these large public works structures. The separation of church and state did not exist in many of these cultures, and so religious and political purposes were very much intertwined. Here, I just think this is kind of fun, is a picture from the 1930s of the exhibition. By the way, the mystery writer Agatha Christie visited this excavation and married one of the archaeologists and wrote a book, Murder in Mesopotamia, that took place on this excavation. So let's move from that specific picture of the ziggurat to broader themes that we're going to be looking at whenever we examine sacred spaces. And we're going to encounter a lot of sacred spaces in this course. We'll be moving on to Egyptian pyramids, to Greek temples, to Roman public buildings like the Colosseum, to Islamic mosques, Buddhist temples, Christian cathedrals. You get the picture. We're going to be looking at a lot of sacred spaces. So what are we looking for? How do we identify a work of art, an architectural work of art, as a sacred space? And these are 4 things to keep in mind throughout the course. You might want to keep a note of this so that you can apply these as tools when you're analyzing, particularly when you're comparatively analyzing different sacred spaces. Exclusivity. Ordinarily, a sacred space ordinarily is probably the wrong word there, is set apart in some way. Maybe it's set apart for practitioners of that religion. There are many mosques, for example, that cannot be entered by non-Muslims. Often, spaces are reserved exclusively for the priestly or clerical classes. Sacred spaces also tend to show material wealth and decoration. One of the ways that archaeologists, when they're excavating a site, think that they've hit upon a temple or a church site is they see, fancier tile, more use of expensive materials, things that are shown that honor the gods or honor the patrons, demonstrate that these patrons are in fact serving the gods. You tend to see evidence that these are sites of ritual and ceremony. And finally, generally speaking, sacred places are located in a significant way at the center of the city, reaching toward the heavens, or perhaps on the spot of an important historical or religious event, a place where a saint appeared, for example. So let's look at this with reference to the Ziggurat of Ur. Exclusivity, you see the cella at the top, which is quite a small building on top of a very large structure. We don't know precisely who could enter the cella, but archaeologists speculate, and based on excavations and what they've seen in Sumerian writings, that only the priests or people with priestly functions could enter the cella. These votive figures are in outside waiting rooms facing toward the altar, again, asking for entrance into the land of the gods, but not actually being able to enter in. In terms of material wealth, you can't really see it from this, but inside the cella were objects of great wealth. So, for example, these inlaid mosaics with precious stones and burial goods and other artifacts that indicate that these were sites of great wealth and that the decorative skills of the society were especially employed in the sacred space. We don't know a lot about the rituals of the Sumerian religion. As I mentioned, the temples were also used for food storage, so we know that they had a public function. But again, the small cella evidence in the writing suggests that this was where ritual sacrifices were made to the gods. And of course, these were in central locations and they reached toward the heavens. The Tower of Babel, people trying to be godlike by reaching toward the heavens, was almost certainly a ziggurat. Notice, by the way, that these sacred spaces are used to lend legitimacy to a political regime. Again, there's no separation of church and state. And we'll see the same thing in medieval towns and Islamic towns, where the location of the palace and the central administrative agencies of the state and of the central religious or sacred spaces, they're often located together. We'll also see, for example, the Great Pyramids reaching toward the heavens, or the Greek temples on the Parthenon, the high point of Athens. Moving on in the political context of Sumeria. Sumeria was an economy dependent on trade. As I mentioned, Sumeria was wealthy in rivers and in agriculture. It had very little in the way of stone. And so it needed to trade to get all sorts of goods, essentially, for the luxury living that its accumulated wealth in agriculture enabled it to have. We know, for example, about the Epic of Gilgamesh, mostly from later Babylonian writings. Most of the cuneiform tablets that have been found record business transactions. They're bills of sale or contracts. And historians speculate that cuneiform, the first writing, was actually developed in order to help Sumeria conduct its international trade. By the way, another kind of writing, if you will, were cylinder seals that were rolled over wet clay. And in order to get this raised impression, you needed to do the seal incised or sunken. And that's called intaglio. And you see a picture of the intaglio cylinder seal and the kind of picture that it made. And that's the cookie cutter kind of picture that they produce, a design in relief. And I just thought this was another vocabulary word you can add to your list. Another piece of evidence of the trade are the precious metals and goods that we find in the sacred spaces. So here we see the bull-headed lyre. This is in your textbook. That blue beard is lapis lazuli, a precious metal that would have come from Afghanistan. And we also see gold, another metal that was not, in fact, mined in Mesopotamia. Here we see the standard of Ur. By the way, this is one to know. If I had to guess which Sumerian artifact was most likely to show up on the art history exam, I would guess this one. But here again, you see the lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Archaeologists have determined that that red stone that you see came all the way from India. The shell probably came from the Persian Gulf, so this is evidence of trade. But there's also evidence of trade in the picture. Again, this is in fact, this was on a wooden box. We'll see a picture of the box later on that was reconstructed by archaeologists. This piece scene on top, you see a banquet. The king is in the upper register sitting with other seated participants. Notice he's larger than any of the other figures. But what's particularly interesting when we're talking about the context in Sumeria is that bottom register, which seems to show people bringing goods to trade. And here we'll see a close-up. Look there on the right, that's almost certainly a fish seller. So again, we see a portrayal of the importance of trading and business in the Sumerian culture. And then, of course, there's the war side of the Standard of Ur, because warfare, as I've mentioned before, was a constant element in Sumerian society. They fought with each other, the Sumerian city-states, and they were repeatedly invaded by their warlike neighbors, who, of course, were tempted by, this gold and lapis lazuli hanging around, ready to be seized. Very interesting here. The top register, it's an early representation of a Sumerian army, and it looks like, and historians think, is a depiction of a border skirmish. Again, I mentioned the Sumerians were constantly fighting with the people on the borders. So again, up on the top, you see the king bursting through the register, larger than life. He stands in front of his bodyguard in a four-wheeled chariot. And by the way, chariots were a hugely important military invention. Civilizations with chariots had a major military advantage, as later civilizations with cannon or tanks would. I mean, we don't think of chariots perhaps as a new weapon, but they definitely were at the time. In the middle, you see soldiers. Again, notice that they are quite uniform. They're iconic. They're deliberately portrayed identically, probably to indicate unity and determination, united purpose, whereas on the right in that middle panel, you see the captives. They're naked, they're wounded, they're gashed up, in disarray. Not clear that the captives would in fact have been captured naked. Again, this nakedness is symbolic. It's iconic of their status as defeated enemies. And then I think what's particularly interesting is this bottom register. What do you notice? You see a technique that the artist uses for telling the story. What you see is on the left, you see a horse or some sort of animal figure pulling the chariot, walking, then trotting, then cantering, and finally galloping. So you actually see a narrative unfolding. Here, by the way, is a close-up of the two soldiers. Again, notice the iconic similarity. Now here is the Warka vase. I included this just again. You see the narrative in the registers, and you also see further evidence of a hierarchical society. The king and his advisors are on top. The king is largest. In the middle, you see the workers. At the bottom, smaller still, animals. And you're seeing a story unfolding. And in fact, what you're seeing demonstrated in both the Standard of Ur and in this relief, that raised kind of sculpture, not sculpture in the round, but the raised three-dimensional figures are called reliefs, as you've seen in earlier chapters. Some devices that you see used are first registers. Registers are how the story is told essentially in horizontal bands. You see hierarchy of scale. The important people are larger than the less important people. And finally, you see an effort to tell the story sequentially. Again, we see the horse moving from a walk to a trot to a canter to a gallop. This slide again demonstrates the registers, the composite perspective where you have a different frontal and side view, and the hierarchy of scale where the important people are larger. And the votive offering is shown out of proportion because it's important. It's something being given to the gods. So why use registers as a narrative technique? Well, you might think about it. We still use registers as a narrative technique. It is a logical way to tell a story pictorially through a succession of pictures. And this is just looking at the Standard of Ur from a variety of different depictions. Now, there you see the reconstructed wooden box on the left. You see part of the war panel, you see the war and the peace. And again, this is a very good demonstration of narrative registers. Okay, we're almost done. And we're moving on to the head of the Akkadian ruler. And what's the question I want to ask here, not that this is it's really not as important a piece of art for your memorization standpoint as the Standard of Ur. But what does it show about how the political context in Mesopotamia changes when the Akkadians conquer the Sumerians? And as you may recall from your book, Sargon I conquers the city-states and unifies them into an empire, and he becomes an actual king of a much larger geographic area. So what does this show? How is this different from the Sumerian votive sculptures? I should have put one of those up on this slide. Well, first of all, it's a king, not ordinary people. Most of the Sumerian sculpture that survives is of patrons, is of regular people and not of the rulers. It's also much more individualized. This is a king with personality. It's still somewhat stylized. That beard, for example, doesn't really look like a real beard. It's iconic. Nevertheless, look at the nose, look at the mouth, the eyes. This is a real person. This is not a symbol of a king. This probably is meant to look at least somewhat like the king being depicted. It's also worth noting that this is made of cast copper, not carved from stone or made from clay. It's not a subtractive, it's an additive sculpture, as of course is clay. This is important because it's a technological advance. We're going to be talking a lot more about casting when we get to our next unit. And finally, this is my last slide, I promise, the victory stele of Naram-Sin. So why is this innovative? This is an important one. This is one you might very well want to be able to identify. And it includes several features that show how Akkadian society is different from Sumerian, but also some very important advances, if you will, in the way narratives are displayed in art. So what do you see? What's different? What's the significance, to begin with, of the horns? They are an icon. They are a symbol of deity. This is a depiction of, this is the first time a king appears as a god in Mesopotamian art. How does it demonstrate hierarchy of scale? Well, the king is a lot larger than his soldiers, and the soldiers, if you'll notice, are bigger than the captives. Notice also that the soldiers, like in the Standard of Ur, are shown in lockstep, very uniform. Again, this is iconic. This is symbolic of their unity, whereas here again, as in the Standard of Ur, the defeated are shown as smaller, as naked, as in disarray. But notice a very important innovation, which is in the way the registers are portrayed, and that is that they're diagonal. The king and the soldiers are marching toward the top, or marching toward the heavens, and the defeated are falling. This is, again, an innovation, and it helps tell the story by changing the style of the register. And there's one final element that helps set this apart and makes it innovative. Look right underneath the captive who appears to have a spear going through his neck. And what do you see? You see a tree. And if you look closely, you'll also see rock. This portrays landscape.